Just before we get to our 3 tips on how to memorize scripture, very briefly, I want to share why. Every day, we're against 3 enemies: our flesh and its sinful desires, the world and its corrupt view of truth, and Satan and his desire to sell you lies. You cannot rely on a strong willpower to fight against all 3. We need God's words in our minds, our hearts, and on the tip of our tongues. And let's not forget, this is how generations of Christians used to engage with Scripture before it was all written down. So let's learn how. Tip number 1, read, repeat, and return. This process starts with reading the Scripture 4 or 5 times so you become familiar with it. And once you've done that, look away and see how much you can say by memory. And then repeat this until you can say the entire Scripture without looking. You can come back to it in maybe an hour, and then again at the end of the day. The most important part about this tip is that you return to this Scripture day after day in order to solidify it in your mind and your heart. And then keep returning to it and never stop, be it once a week or once a month, because it's so easy to fill our minds with everything but the Bible. I'd recommend writing down your memorized scriptures so you can keep going through them and maybe even set reminders to do this. Or check out the Discover More section for this episode. There are some great tools to help you do this. Tip number 2, start small. Unless your memory is insane, I would start small. You might have a great desire to memorize a whole chapter of the Bible or even a whole book of the Bible, but break it down. Just start with 1 verse, and once you've committed it to memory, add it on to the next one. If it's a long verse, just break it down into half or even a quarter. When you start small, you can piece it together into something much larger, and it's so much easier to memorize sections that make a whole rather than memorizing the whole thing in one go. And lastly, tip number 3, let it resonate. What I mean by that is you're far more likely to remember something that means a lot to you than something you feel you should just have to remember. Now, of course, the whole Bible should mean a lot to us, but the reality is there are some verses that mean so much more to us than others for all manner of reasons at different points in our life. But when something is important to you, you remember it. And you're far more likely to want to memorize it over days and weeks if it's precious to you. So let the Scripture touch your heart and fill your spirit as you begin memorizing it. Psalm 1, verse 2-3 says, "But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He's like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers." We memorize Scripture not because we want to show how much we can quote, but because it produces abundant life in our hearts. So let's remember these 3 tips on how to do it. Tip number 1, read, repeat, and return. Tip number 2, start small. And tip number 3, let it resonate. As I've mentioned, check out the Discover More area for further tools that can help you memorize Scripture and a step-by-step guide through a memorization method.